think about the medieval world for a moment.
Uh,
Knights, castles, the usual picture.
right.
Now, here's something striking. About half the people living then, their voices are just missing from the main story we usually get.
Yeah, largely absent.
So the big question we're diving into today is, well, why? Why were medieval women's stories silenced for so long?
That's exactly it. And it's not like it just happened by accident. We're talking about really deep-seated, interconnected barriers.
Okay.
So in this deep dive, we're going to unpack those systems, look at some incredible women who actually pushed back, and sort of grasp the long-term effects of this historical silencing.
So this isn't just about pointing out gaps in old history books. We're trying to add a really vital piece back into the puzzle, right?
That's right.
To get a much richer, more complete picture of that whole period.
Precisely. It helps explain why it feels like we know, well, comparatively little about the day-to-day lives and inner thoughts of medieval women.
And we get to introduce you to some genuinely amazing individuals along the way. So our mission here is really to bring these often unheard stories into the light, adding, real depth and complexity to how we see the past and the women history tended to forget.
Yeah, understanding their rich inner lives.
Okay, so to start us off, what were the main things, the sort of underlying factors that stopped women's voices from really being recorded or remembered back then?
Well, the analysis really points to this combination, this sort of interwoven set of systemic barriers. They seriously limited women's ability to participate in public life. And as a direct result, their ability to leave any kind of historical mark.
So what were these barriers specifically?
We can break them down into a few key areas. Cultural norms and gender roles, a really big one. Then there's the huge influence of religious doctrines.
Right, the church.
Legal and political exclusion, and also fundamental economic constraints. Each one played a pretty crucial part in creating a society where basically women's voices just weren't heard much.
Okay, let's dig into those cultural norms first. What was the kind of dominant thinking about women and, their proper place?
The main cultural story, you could say, positioned women as fundamentally subordinate to men. Naturally so, they believed.
So that was just the accepted baseline.
Pretty much. The ideal woman. She was supposed to be obedient, modest, and deeply pious. Her main role was seen as being firmly inside the home.
The domestic sphere.
Exactly. Marriage, motherhood, managing the household, that was the core focus. And this wasn't just like a suggestion, it was a deeply embedded social expectation. You saw it everywhere.
So women's identities were tied mainly to family and home.
Yeah, primarily defined by their relationships to husbands, fathers, sons, and their domestic duties, not really as independent people with their own goals or ideas.
And how does society keep reinforcing these, well, pretty narrow ideas?
Think about the stories people told, the songs they sang, the art they made. Women were very often shown in these really limited ways.
Like stereotypes.
Totally. Either the perfectly pure, almost androsic maiden, or the dangerous, seductive temptress. There wasn't much room in between for just complex human beings with their own thoughts and desires.
So even noble women, wealthy women.
Even for them. Despite their status, the focus usually wasn't on encouraging them to develop intellectually or get involved in politics. Their main value was often seen in making good marriage alliances and, crucially, producing heirs, preferably male ones.
Right. So the culture itself limited how women were seen and what they were encouraged to do.
Absolutely. The cultural narratives actively restricted the perceived scope and, frankly, the value of women's lives beyond those domestic roles.
Okay. And then you mentioned the church. Its influence was massive back then, wasn't it?
Oh, immense. The medieval Christian church wasn't just about spiritual matters. It shaped social attitudes, political views, almost everything.
How did its teaching specifically contribute to silencing women?
Well, you had really influential theologians like St. Augustine or St. Thomas Aquinas using interpretations of the Bible to basically reinforce this idea that women were inherently inferior.
The Eve story, for instance.
Exactly. The story of Eve and the fall of man was constantly brought up as, quote-unquote, proof of women's weakness, their tendency towards sin. And this was then used to justify why they shouldn't hold positions of authority.
So religion was used to back up the social structure.
It provided what seemed like a divine justification for keeping women subordinate. The church actively defined women's roles, really emphasizing marriage and motherhood as their God-given purpose.
And if women didn't follow that path?
Well, women who deviated, maybe they chose not to marry, or they were interested in intellectual things, or held unconventional beliefs, they were often looked at with suspicion, sometimes even accused of heresy.
Wow. And education.
The church controlled most of it. The main centers of learning, like monastic schools or the early universities, were almost completely closed off to women.
So that directly blocked their access to intellectual life.
Absolutely. It severely limited their ability to participate in theological debates, philosophical discussions, or contribute to the body of written knowledge. The church effectively acted as a gatekeeper to intellectual engagement for women.
Okay, so cultural norms, religious doctrine.
Right.
What about the legal side? How did laws restrict women?
The legal systems really cemented women's marginal position. Their rights were significantly curtailed, especially when it came to things like owning property, inheriting, or having any say in governance.
You hear about coverture, right? What was that?
Right, coverture was a key principle in many places. It basically meant that when a woman married, her legal identity was sort of absorbed into her husband's. She became an extension of him, legally speaking.
So she couldn't own property on her own
Ooh.
or make contracts.
Not independently, no. Couldn't enter contracts, couldn't sue someone in court without her husband's or a male guardian's okay. It essentially denied married women an independent legal existence.
That's quite fundamental.
It really is. Now, widows or unmarried women might have had a little more legal freedom, but they still faced a lot of societal pressure and legal restrictions.
And politically, any power there?
Almost none. Women were pretty much entirely excluded from holding political office or positions of real power. Yes, you had some influential queens or noblewomen sometime.
But their power came through men.
Usually, yeah. It often stemmed from their relationship to a king, a husband, a son, not from their own inherent right to rule or govern. This meant women had virtually zero say in making the laws that controlled their own lives.
It's like a cycle, isn't it? No power means no ability to change the rules that deny you power.
Exactly. It perpetuated their disempowerment. They were systematically shut out of the processes that shaped their world.
It feels like every door was closed. You also mentioned economic factors.
Yes, and that's crucial too. The day-to-day economic reality for most medieval women was tough and limiting.
How so?
Well, regardless of social class, most women were involved in pretty demanding labor. For poorer women, that meant back-breaking work in farming, spinning, and weaving textiles for hours on end, domestic service.
Leaving no time or energy for anything else.
Very little, yeah. It consumed almost all their time and energy, leaving hardly any room for intellectual pursuits or creative work.
What about women in towns? Did they have more options?
Some women did work in trades or crafts, maybe running small businesses, often alongside husbands or fathers, but their work often went undocumented.
So it's harder for historians to find evidence.
Right. And even then, their economic dependence on men generally limited their autonomy. Without independent financial resources, it was incredibly difficult for women to challenge social norms, support themselves outside of traditional roles, or, amplify their own voices.
So economic dependence was another layer holding them back.
Definitely. It reinforced their reliance on male relatives and limited their ability to act independently or express dissenting views.
Okay, so we've got this picture of really powerful systemic barriers. Cultural, religious, legal, economic. How did all this specifically lead to silencing their intellectual contributions? It feels like a distinct kind of suppression.
It really was. The analysis makes clear that suppressing women's intellectual and creative voices was a particularly profound way they were silenced. Think about writing, for example.
The main way ideas got recorded and spread back then.
Exactly. And that whole world writing, producing books, distributing texts was overwhelmingly dominated by men. They controlled the means of production, you could say.
So it wasn't just that women weren't encouraged to write, but even if they did, getting it seen was another hurdle.
Precisely. A woman who did want to write faced huge obstacles. We mentioned limited education. That's a big one.
Right.
But even if she was educated, she often lacked patronage, the financial backing and social support that male writers often relied on.
And just societal disapproval.
Oh, absolutely. A woman engaging in intellectual work, especially writing for a public audience, was often seen as stepping way outside her proper role. It could lead to criticism, being ostracized, or worse. Multiple barriers actively discouraged it.
And yet, despite all that, the analysis shows some women did manage it. They left written records. Those must be incredibly precious.
Incredibly so. The relatively small number of writings by medieval women that have survived give us these rare, invaluable glimpses into their thoughts, their lives, their perspectives.
Often from specific backgrounds.
Yeah, often from women in privileged positions, maybe nobility, or women within religious communities. But these texts are vital because they reveal an intelligence and creativity that the dominant historical narrative often just completely obscured. They challenge that standard narrative.
And the analysis highlights a few really remarkable individuals. Let's start with Christine de Pizan. Her story sounds incredibly important.
Christine de Pizan lived roughly 1364 to 1430. She's a truly key figure, widely seen as one of Europe's first professional female authors.
Professional, meaning she earned a living from it.
Yes, she was born in Venice, grew up in the French court, and luckily her father encouraged her education. When her husband died relatively young, she actually turned to writing to support herself and her children.
Wow, that's quite a story in itself.
It is, and she was prolific. Poetry, political writings, and really significantly for us, works that we'd now see as early feminist texts. She was groundbreaking, a professional woman writer directly tackling the woman question.
And her most famous work, The Book of the City of Ladies.
Yeah.
What made that so revolutionary?
The Book of the City of Ladies from 1405 is just remarkable for its time. Christine wrote it specifically to counter all the misogynistic literature that was so common then.
So it was a direct rebuttal.
A direct point-by-point rebuttal. In the book, she imagines building this allegorical city, defended by reason, rectitude, and justice, and populating it with examples of virtuous, accomplished women from history, mythology, scripture.
To show what women were capable of.
Exactly. She systematically takes down negative stereotypes about women's character and intellect and argues powerfully that women have just as much capacity for achievement in any field if, and this is the key, if they're given the same opportunities as men.
That's an incredibly modern-sounding argument for 1405.
It really is. She was directly challenging the dominant negative narrative and offering this positive vision of female potential, a powerful defense of women's worth.
I imagine that didn't go down well with everyone. Did she face backlash?
Oh, definitely. Just by engaging in public intellectual debate, which was seen as strictly men's territory, she drew criticism. People accused her of stepping out of line, being presumptuous.
But she kept going.
That's what's so impressive. She persisted, defended her work, kept writing, and her legacy, although it took time to be fully recognized, absolutely inspired later generations of women thinkers. Even facing resistance, she made her mark.
Okay, moving on to Julian of Norwich. Very different figure, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Yes, quite different. Julian lived around 1342 to 1416, an English mystic. Her work, Revelations of Divine Love, is actually one of the earliest books we have in English written by a woman.
And she lived as an anchoress. What did that involve?
It meant living a solitary life, usually enclosed in a small cell attached to a church dedicated entirely to prayer and contemplation.
So, withdrawn from the world?
Very much so. Her writings came directly from a series of intense visions she had when she was gravely ill. They offer these incredibly profound theological insights, but the core message is always about God's immense love and compassion, a unique female theological voice from that time.
The analysis mentions her vision of God being maternal. That must have stood out.
Hugely radical for the time. She presented God in these nurturing, almost motherly terms, which really challenged the standard, very patriarchal imagery common in medieval Christianity.
And a famous line, all shall be well.
All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. It captures her message of ultimate hope and trust in divine love, even amidst suffering. Just a powerful statement of resilience.
Did her work get widely read?
Not really, not in her own lifetime. Partly because she was a woman, partly her secluded life. Her work didn't circulate widely. She was relatively unknown for centuries until her writings were rediscovered and appreciated much later. So her unique perspective was somewhat lost for a long time.
Fascinating. Okay, and then there's Marjorie Kempe. She sounds like maybe the most controversial of the three.
Marjorie Kempe, yes, lived about 1373 to 1438, an English laywoman, not a nun or noblewoman. And her book, The Book of Marjorie Kempe, is often called the first autobiography in the English language.
An autobiography, so her own life story.
Her own story, yes. It details her spiritual journey, her visions, her extensive pilgrimages across Europe and the Holy Land, and crucially, her struggles with fitting into society's expectations.
What made her controversial?
She was very outspoken, very emotional in public. Known for loud weeping, talking openly about her religious experiences, sometimes seeming to preach. Activities definitely not considered appropriate for women then. She was a polarizing figure.
So she really broke the mold of the quiet, modest woman.
Absolutely. She faced constant criticism, even accusations of heresy, for behaving in ways deemed unacceptable for her gender.
But her book gives us something unique.
Incredibly unique. It's this rare, raw, first-person account of a medieval woman's life, her spiritual desires, her travels, her conflicts with authorities, her family life. It gives amazing insight into trying to live a devout life while pushing against society's constraints.
And she couldn't write herself.
No, she was illiterate. She had to dictate her entire, quite long book to scribes, which just shows her determination, doesn't it? Her drive to have her story recorded despite the obstacles. Her life itself challenged the norms.
It's really striking that all these women, in such different ways, faced real risks just for expressing their thoughts or experiences.
That's such a key point. They weren't exceptions to the rule in terms of risk. Challenging the status quo was dangerous. Criticism, being ostracized, these were common.
And for women writing about religion or politics.
The danger ramped up. Accusations of heresy were a constant threat, and the consequences could be severe imprisonment, even execution.
So the fear must have silenced many others.
It almost certainly did. You have to assume that the fear of those repercussions deterred countless other women from ever writing down their ideas or sharing their experiences more widely. Expressing yourself was genuinely perilous.
But the analysis also brings up convents, religious life, as a sort of alternative space, offering some women opportunities they wouldn't have otherwise.
Yes, that's an important nuance. For some medieval women, entering a convent or pursuing a religious life did offer an escape from certain secular pressures, and crucially, access to education and intellectual pursuits.
So convents had libraries, opportunities for study.
Often, yes. While still ultimately under male church authority, convents could provide a supportive community of women, resources for learning, and a degree of autonomy that was pretty rare outside those walls.
And many surviving works by women come from this context.
A significant number do, yes. Nuns, anchoresses like Julian, they used that space to explore spiritual questions, write theology, history, poetry. It offered a path for intellectual engagement often closed off elsewhere.
And Hildegard of Bingen is maybe the most famous example of this. Her achievements sound incredible.
Absolutely. Hildegard 1098 to 1179, a German Benedictine abbess. Just an astonishing figure, a true polymath.
In what fields?
Theology, music, natural science, medicine, her range was extraordinary. Her book Civius, recording her theological visions, made her a respected authority across Europe.
She corresponded with popes and emperors.
Yes, which shows her influence. And her music complex, Beautiful Chants, is still performed and recorded today. Just incredible creative genius, a truly exceptional woman operating within that religious structure.
The analysis mentions she presented her work as divinely inspired. Was that a strategy?
It seems likely it was, at least partly. By framing her writings and insights as coming directly from God, as divine visions, she could perhaps gain a level of authority and legitimacy that might have been denied to her if she presented them simply as her own intellectual work, a way to navigate the intense male dominance of theology.
Smart move, perhaps.
A very astute one. But even Hildegard, with all her renown in this divine framing, still faced pushback and criticism from some male clergy who questioned her right as a woman to teach or have such authority, shows how deep the biases ran. Even she had to navigate them strategically.
But you also noted that religious life wasn't a perfect solution or available to everyone.
No, definitely not. There were limitations. For one thing, entering a convent often required a dowry, so it was mainly accessible to women from wealthier families.
So class was still a factor.
Yes. And again, even inside the convent, women were still subject to the oversight of male bishops and the broader church hierarchy. Their autonomy wasn't absolute.
And the focus on religion itself could be limiting.
It could. The strong emphasis on spiritual purity and sticking strictly to church doctrine might have sometimes limited the scope of women's intellectual work, steering it towards acceptable religious themes rather than, say, secular philosophy or political critique. So opportunities, yes, but within certain bounds.
Okay, it's really clear how deeply entrenched these silencing systems were, even with these incredible individual exceptions and the limited space within convents. But the analysis talks about an early feminist consciousness starting to emerge. How did that manifest?
Well, despite everything, especially in the later medieval period, you do see the beginnings of what we can recognize as a kind of feminist awareness. Women like Christine de Pizan, especially.
With her direct challenges.
Yes, her reasoned arguments against misogyny. And maybe even Julian of Norwich, with her inclusive, compassionate theology that implicitly counter purely patriarchal views of God. They were articulating ideas that fundamentally questioned the existing power structures between genders.
Even if they didn't call it feminism.
Exactly. They wouldn't have used our modern term, but they were laying down intellectual tracks, you could say, for later critiques of inequality. They started asking the right questions.
And you mentioned women's networks being important. How did those work?
Hugely important, especially because women lacked formal institutions or public stages. These informal networks, correspondence between educated women, shared ideas within convents, mutual support systems, they became vital channels.
For sharing ideas and encouragement.
Yes, amplifying voices, fostering intellectual exchange, offering solidarity. These networks, often invisible in the main historical records, were crucial for sustaining women's perspectives and helping their ideas survive and spread, even on a small scale. They provided essential support.
It's amazing to think about those hidden connections. Did these early ideas, this proto-feminist thought, have a lasting impact? Did it filter down through the centuries?
It seems they did. While maybe not always directly traceable or widely known in their own time, the arguments and perspectives put forward by women like Christine certainly resonated. They influenced later generations of women thinkers and writers who took up the cause of challenging gender norms.
So they contributed to the longer story of feminism.
Absolutely. They formed part of that long trajectory, contributing key ideas and demonstrating female intellectual capability, which later feminist movements built upon. Their ideas had long-term ripple effects.
So understanding this history, the silencing, the resistance, it's not just about correcting the record for the medieval period. It changes how we see history overall, doesn't it?
Profoundly. The systematic silencing of women means the history we've inherited is skewed. It's dominated by male voices, male experiences, male perspectives.
An incomplete picture.
Exactly. By overlooking or minimizing women's contributions, their work, their lives, we get a less complex, less accurate, frankly less interesting understanding of the past. It's like watching a movie with half the characters missing. The silencing created a biased record.
But scholars now are actively working to fix that, aren't they? To bring these voices back.
Yes, and that work is incredibly important. Scholars digging into archives, finding forgotten manuscripts, rereading sources with fresh eyes, highlighting figures like Christine, Julian, Hildegard, Marjorie. It's genuinely enriching our understanding.
Revealing a more dynamic medieval world.
Much more diverse, much more dynamic. We're seeing the active participation and intellectual contributions of women in ways that were previously ignored or dismissed. This ongoing work is recovering those voices and giving us a fuller picture.
And you feel this has relevance beyond just history classes. There are broader lessons here for us today.
Oh, absolutely. This isn't just an academic cleanup job. Recognizing these medieval women's stories, understanding the immense barriers they navigated, it's a vital step toward a more inclusive, more equitable view of history in general.
And their resilience.
Their resilience is just incredibly powerful. It's a timeless reminder of why it's so important to actively listen for and amplify voices that have been marginalized in any time period, including our own.
So studying their lives connects to ongoing issues.
Definitely. It gives us insight into what is really a universal struggle, the struggle for self-expression, for agency, for the fundamental right to be heard and have your experiences valued. And sadly, that's a struggle that still resonates very strongly today in many places. The fight for women's voices continues.
Okay, so just to quickly recap, we've looked at how this mix of cultural norms, religious rules, legal and political exclusion, and economic limits work together to really silence medieval women.
A powerful combination of forces.
Yet even against all that, we saw these incredible examples: Christine de Pizan, Julian of Norwich, Marjorie Kemp, Hildegard of Bingen women who found ways, different ways, to make themselves heard and live a real legacy.
Yes, their stories are just these powerful testaments, really, to that enduring human drive to express oneself and be recognized, even when the odds seem completely stacked against you.
It really does make you think. You know, considering all those barriers designed to silence medieval women, what other voices might we still be missing from the past? And maybe more subtly, what kinds of silencing might still be happening today, ways we might not even fully recognize?
That's a really crucial question to end on, isn't it? It pushes us to keep questioning whose stories get told, whose perspectives shape our understanding, and to be more active in making sure we hear a truly inclusive range of human experiences, both from history and in the world around us now.